Settle in, get comfortable, and let the world outside grow quiet. Take a deep breath, let your shoulders fall, and let my voice be a small, steady light at the edge of your evening. This tale is based on true events from the year 1888, and I will tell them as I remember them, fictionalized, gently dramatized through my own eyes. If you find comfort in this voice, I invite you to subscribe and like the channel. If you have a thought to share, tell me where you're listening from, what time is on your clock, or which case you would like to hear next. I will listen as I listen then. Before we begin, let me tell you plainly who I am and who I will refer to most in this story. Call it a small character Bible, if you like, names to hold on to in the dark. My name is Thomas William Hartley. I am 32 years of age in the year 1888, and I write for a modest evening paper called the Evening Ledger. I live in lodgings on Brick Lane, a slow walk from Whitechapel, where the gaslights smear into the fog. My editor is Edward Percival Langley, a pragmatic man with a soft voice and a quicker pen. Among the constables I came to know were Detective Inspector Edmund Reed of H Division and Chief Inspector Frederick George Aberline of Scotland Yard's Criminal Investigation Department. Sir Robert Anderson was the Assistant Commissioner overseeing matters at the Yard, and Dr. Thomas Bond offered calm, clinical observations as police surgeon. There are other names you will hear, names of women who lived on the margins and whose lives became the centre of a city's anxious attention. Mary Ann Nichols, 43 years of age, found on the morning of August the 31st, 1888, in Bucks Row. Annie Chapman, 47, found on September 8th in a yard in Hanbury Street. Elizabeth Stride, about 44, and Catherine Eddowes, about 46, both found on the night of September 30th in two different places, Burner Street and Mitre Square, respectively. And later, in early November, Mary Jane Kelly, about 25, who lived in Miller's Court off Dorset Street. There are, too, men whose names would be discussed and debated: Montague John Druitt, Aaron Kosminski, and George Chapman, born Surin Kwasowski. I knew of them then as names in reports, and later as topics of conjecture. I will speak of them with care, for we never knew the truth. I never knew who did these deeds. I do not claim to have solved them. We are in East London, in the late summer and autumn of 1888. Whitechapel, then, was a place of compressed lives, narrow streets, lodging houses stacked with beds, markets spilling with voices, and pubs that glowed like small suns against the damp. The streets were lit by gas and softened by the fog that rolls in off the Thames. There was industry nearby, factories, yards, and the movement of goods. And there was also a kind of hush after dark, when the carts are gone, and only the far bells and a late whistle remind you that the city goes on. Poverty was a quiet, constant presence. People found small economies and small comforts where they could. My nightly routine before the first terrible autumn was a kind of small ritual. I walked the lane from Brick Lane toward the heart of Whitechapel to meet the paper's messenger, collect the latest copy of the evening dispatches, and then take the longer route that would pass by the docks and the police station. I liked to watch the night patrols. Men in blue with jackets buttoned high against the fog, cap brims low, boots whispering on cobbles. I learned the cadence of their steps and the tired way they rubbed their hands by the fire in the watch-house. On other nights, I would be at the Ledger's office, the lamp low on my desk as I wrote up a column about a market or a petition or a small kindness someone had shown a neighbour. There was a quiet hardship to those nights, and a steady kindness to be found as well. On a regular evening, I would pass lodging houses with their little windows lit like pockets of warmth. I would hear the singers from the pubs, carols and sea songs, and the cracked laughter of men, easy with another pint. I would smell the stalls, onions and hops, and the lingering perfume of warmed meat. The gaslight pooled in semicircles across the pavement, and the fog held the light, making halos that moved as the lamps swayed in the wind. There was a rhythm to it, a reassuring, if austere, comfort. It is important you picture this quiet first, because the change that came did not arrive as thunder. It arrived as a shiver in a calm room, a small disturbance that widened slowly, like a ring on a still pond. I will take you there in detail, but gently. Take another deep breath now. Let your body remember its own warmth. Let the lamp beside you be steady. What does a street feel like while it sleeps? And what do we notice when something unseen has walked its length? When I walked those lanes, I felt both apart and separate, an observer and a neighbour. My paper sent me to cover the small municipal matters and to listen at police corners for news. My editor, Mr. Langley, liked facts laid out plainly. Inspector Aberline liked facts too, and sometimes he would speak to me through a thin door or in a brief corridor where the lamps are dim and voices may be lowered. Those small exchanges formed the scaffolding of my knowledge, and as a reporter I learned the names of streets, the regulars at inns, the lighting of the lamps, and the times the patrols changed. Before the autumn turned, our conversations were about rent and relief, about a market stall closing and a new workhouse rule. That was the rhythm. How often in life do we continue in a familiar pattern until some small, unwelcome note changes the melody? I will tell you, in the next chapter, of a morning in late August, when that note came, how I first heard of Mary Ann Nichols, and how that one name would begin to alter the evenings and the lives we thought we understood. But that's a story for the next chapter. For now, let the image of the gaslit street hold you. Let the sound of my voice become part of your quiet, and when you are ready, we will walk the lane together. Take a slow breath and settle deeper into your pillow. Remember, these are true events, told as I saw and felt them, gently dramatized for the sake of telling. In the previous chapter, I introduced the names you will return to, my own, the constables, the women whose lives I will speak about, and I described Whitechapel as it was before the fear came. Now, let us walk a little closer into the lives that filled those streets. Whitechapel in 1888 was a neighbourhood of edges. Markets and workshops coexisted with lodgings so tight, the beds almost shared breath. Families made do in rooms scarcely larger than wardrobes. A woman might rise at first light to mend and scrub for a neighbour, then sweep flotsam from a doorstep and walk to a market where the vendors greet each other by name. Men who had worked the docks the night before moved like slow tides. Some found day work, many did not. Children went barefoot in the warmer months and learned the city's hard lessons early. There were also quiet, stooped businesses that opened as the fog thinned. The baker with the flour under his nails, the tailor who bent over a waistcoat, the small shops that sold tea and tobacco. Pubs thrummed gently at dusk, and lodging houses took in the transient souls. Men with small suitcases, women seeking a corner to sleep, the occasional traveller who would bed down for a single night before moving on. It was not all sorrow. There were warm gestures and shared bread and a neighbour's courtesy. I remember a woman at the corner of Dorset and Brick Lane who would carry a kettle of stew to anyone who looked frostbitten on a bitter evening. It is these small acts of humanity I can hold on to most clearly now. I will tell you about some of the places by their names so you can form them in your mind. Bucks Row, a narrow alley of houses with small backyards, was one such place. Hanbury Street had stacks of yards and small stalls. Burner Street opened into a cluster of small courtyards, and Daltfield's Yard was a tucked-away spot where a light might be seen late and then fade. Mitre Square was an enclosed space close to the city, where the glow of the lamps met the dark of the church walls. Miller's Court was a small court off Dorset Street, thin, close, and very private. Think of these places not as maps, but as rooms in a house you know by touch. Every night I walked the routes I have told you of. My editor, Edward Percival Langley, kept a small office on Leman Street, where the ledgers were proofed by lamplight. He would pass me a slip of paper with a name or an address and say simply, "Hartley, find what you can, but tell me nothing you cannot prove." He valued restraint. It was my habit to call at the H Division station to see what the night patrol had observed. There, I spoke quietly with Inspector Edmund Reed, whose face had a gravity I grew to respect, and sometimes with Chief Inspector Frederick Aberline from Scotland Yard, who carried himself with a calm that steadied the men around him. We spoke often of small things, a missing ledger here, a stray letter there, and we shared a common fatigue. The nights had a particular sameness in the way they wore you down. The fog, the wet cobbles, the eyes of those who watched from blind doorways. We were tired, and yet our work required we keep a keener watch than before. The routine was familiar. Record the complaint, note the guest at a lodging house, tally the numbers at the night shelter. But there was also a quiet undercurrent of care. The constables would check on the elderly and keep an eye on the pubs, where arguments could start small and end in trouble. They would walk the same route twice to make certain no one had missed a step. I learned their rounds, from the churchyard to the market, through the courts and back along the canal. How does a community cope with scarcity? Often through patterns that become second nature. Women would wander the markets late, looking for a warmth or a place to sit. Men would stand in yards and exchange work tips. Children chased one another among crates at dusk. In the early days of that year, I believed we would continue in that way. Small economies, mutual toleration, an ever-present fog we could see through by candlelight and by habit. There were, of course, private sorrows. I met people who kept their grief beneath the collar of their coat, who mended the seams of their lives one stitch at a time. I met street sellers whose voices had become a part of the night's music. I encountered women who leaned on the kindness of others for a cup of tea. It was these quiet details that I wrote about for the ledger. I would sometimes sit in the low light of a grocer's shop, my notebook on my knee, and listen to a woman recount a loss. Her voice would be small but certain, and I would write down both the sorrow and the small solace that followed. Perhaps you wonder why I, a reporter, felt so close to these streets. It was not only my work, it was where I slept and where I kept my desk. My lodgings at 17 Brick Lane were small, and my landlady, Mrs. Fletcher, would knock on my door and offer a good kettle of tea if I returned late. I would sometimes light a lamp and look out over the lane and see the watchman make his slow round. People would ask me how I could bear the fog and the fatigue, and I would answer with a quietness of my own. We learn the city's rhythms and we find a way to sleep between them. There was a comfort to routine then, a soft assurance that the city would march on. I cannot tell you I slept without dreams. I had them, sometimes about a lane I had not yet walked, sometimes about a face I had only glimpsed. Yet the pattern of the street steadied me. If you are listening now, perhaps you too have a small routine. A warm cup before bed, a shawl wrapped about your shoulders. Let that gentle sameness cradle you as we continue. In the next chapter, I will tell you of the morning when the pattern began to fray, the first call that brought me to Bucks Row, and the name that none of us expected. But that is a story for the next chapter. Breathe in slowly, and let the city sounds be distant notes behind your breathing. Remember, this is my memory, based on true events, softened and shaped by what I saw and how I felt. In the earlier chapters, I tried to paint the ordinary evening in Whitechapel. The markets, the lodging houses, the routine. Now I will tell you of the morning that changed everything. The morning of August 31st, 1888, when the first death that came to be counted among those terrible months was discovered. It was, by my recollection, a damp and grey morning. The fog had not yet lifted, and the gas lamps at the corners stood like sentries. I had been at the Ledger late the night before, and had taken a short walk in the small hours to clear my head. I returned to my room at 17 Brick Lane with a pocketed notebook and a cup of tea that tasted of soot and comfort. When I opened my eyes the next morning, there was a message slipped beneath my door from the office, an urgent note asking me to make my way to Bucks Row. Bucks Row is a narrow way, hemmed by simple houses and the backyards of small tenements. I knew it by the sound of the carts that passed by earlier, by the smell of the coal and the sudden hush that comes when a door is left ajar. The walk from Brick Lane takes only a few minutes, but in that moment the distance seemed longer. I dressed carefully. The fog had clung to the panes of glass like breath. As I walked, I felt the city awake beneath my feet, the rattle of a barrow, the distant clang of factory work, someone calling a child's name. When I reached Bucks Row, I found a small crowd gathered, pressed like moths toward a lamp. Policemen kept the people back with the polite firmness I had come to associate with them. I made my way to Mr. Langley's appointed place and waited until a constable, one whose face I recognized from previous nights, permitted me to step nearer. The constable spoke in a low voice and pointed toward a quiet yard. I will not describe what I saw in graphic terms. What I can tell you is that a woman had been found, and that the sight of her unsettled the calm of the morning. Her name, I learned shortly thereafter, was Mary Ann Nichols. She was 43 years of age. The initial confusion at the scene was soft but sharp in its own way. Men exchanged small facts in hushed tones, the time she was seen, the people who had passed by the yard hours before, the way the light caught a particular corner of the cobbles. Inspector Reed was on the scene, his face set in that quiet line I have described. Inspector Aberline arrived from the yard soon after, his walk steady, his eyes taking in the yard and the surrounding doors. They spoke with each other and with the constables about what had been found and what they should do next. Dr. Thomas Bond, the police surgeon, arrived, and he moved with the measured care of a man used to seeing sorrow. As a reporter, I kept a small distance and took my notes. The police were methodical. They made careful measurements. They asked about the time of death as best they could, and they spoke with neighbors who might have heard or seen something unusual. There was an attempt, on those first hours, to treat the matter as any other, to record what was known and what was conjecture, to avoid alarm while fulfilling a duty to report. Yet beneath the official calm, there was a stir of something else, a feeling among the gathered people that what had been found in Bucks Row was not merely an unfortunate death, but the beginning of a thread whose end none of us could tell. I remember thinking, in the hush between one interview and the next, of Mrs. Fletcher and her kettle. I thought of how small and ordinary the acts of a neighbourhood are. Someone sweeping a step, someone sharing bread, someone locking a door for the night. This woman's life intersected with those ordinary acts, and, in the morning stillness, her being gone carved a small, sharp hollow into the day. The inquest would come later. I was present for parts of it in a professional capacity, and I wrote down witness statements and the police report. There were no modern laboratories then, no elastic networks of evidence to produce a certain answer. The police worked with what they had: statements, watchman's recollection, the surgeon's trained eye. It is important to know this, because when the events that would follow began to suggest a pattern, our tools for answering the pattern were blunt and slow. At the ledger that afternoon, Mr. Langley told me simply to keep the tone steady, to avoid suggestion, and to record the facts. The city responded with a kind of muted curiosity. Some people read the accounts and closed the paper to go about their day. Others paused and looked around the corner at the alleyways as if their glance might ward off further misfortune. The initial disbelief was a common reaction. Surely, many thought, it was an isolated tragedy. We told ourselves that. We wanted to believe it. In the days that followed, I found myself more often at the station, more often walking the lanes. I felt, without knowing why in those first weeks, as if some small radar in my chest had been turned on, tuned to the way doors opened, to the hush of footsteps, to the times when a lamp would suddenly be snuffed. I was sleepier than usual, and my pen moved under the careful watch of editors and constables. I could not have known then that this was the start of a sequence that would hold the city in a peculiar unease. All I knew was that a life had ended, and that this ending had pulled at the texture of our nights. Why does a town notice one death more than another? Perhaps because this one came at a time when people were already watching the margins. Perhaps because the manner in which we learned of it, by a constable's report and the hush of a small yard at dawn, made the rest of the day feel fragile. I went home that evening tired and thoughtful, and I wrote my copy with the steady restraint Mr. Langley required. I will tell you, in the next chapter, how the investigation began in earnest, and how the tools and men of the Metropolitan Police and Scotland Yard set about their work. But that, as ever, is a story for the next chapter. Take a slow breath and let your shoulders melt into whatever supports you. Recall gently the morning in Bucks Row that I described in the last chapter, and remember that I am speaking as one who was there, watching, asking, and trying to keep the facts steady. In this chapter, I will describe how the police and the newspapers moved when the first case demanded more than the usual attention, how men in plain coats and in darker offices tried to fit small facts into a sensible pattern, and how the limited tools of the age shaped what could be learned. The Metropolitan Police, which had been established to serve the whole of London, had within it the Criminal Investigation Department, commonly called CID. The Yard, often referred to as Scotland Yard, was the administrative heart where officers like Chief Inspector Frederick George Aberline worked, men who were trained to read clues and to interview witnesses. Local policing in Whitechapel was organised through H Division, the station whose men walked the midnight streets and knew the lanes as if the streets themselves had names for them. Detective Inspector Edmund Reed was one of the H Division's experienced men. He walked the courts and listened to the people. I visited both doors, and found the officers courteous even in their fatigue. In those early days, the police method was painstaking and human. They gathered witness statements. They walked the routes at the same times people said they had walked them. And they cross-checked the timings. They sent for the surgeon to examine the scene and the body. Dr. Thomas Bond offered judgment based on the evidence his senses afforded him: sight, touch, the smell of the air. He would speak of time of death as an estimation, and of wounds without embellishment. There was no modern forensic laboratory, no catalogue of DNA to sift through, no city-wide fingerprint ledgers in the way we imagine today. Photography had begun to be used for official purposes, and officers took photographs of certain scenes, but the tools were limited by the processes of the day. Newspapers such as my own were both observers and engines of public curiosity. Mr. Langley at the Ledger wanted accuracy, but he also knew that the public sought reassurance. There were other papers, some that leaned toward sensation, and their urgency sometimes drove a restlessness in the streets. I remember articles that asked questions aloud and letters to the editor that demanded swift answers. The public pressure came in the form of readers who wanted to know whether they should lock their doors, and in the form of politicians who inquired about the state of public safety. The men at Scotland Yard met to consider what could be done. Sir Robert Anderson, the Assistant Commissioner, balanced protocol with the reality of an anxious population. He spoke of the necessity of order and discipline, and he relied on the experienced men like Aberline to put questions to the constables and to the people of Whitechapel. There were calls for more patrols, for a visible presence on the streets at night. Constables were instructed to take particular care in the lanes and yards that were more isolated than others. Night patrols were increased, and men who walked those beats did so with fingers numb and eyes sharper for the faintest noise. As a reporter, I was permitted at times to see inside the H Division station. The officers worked long hours, and when night turned to early morning, they would do a quick tally of their rounds. They noted who had been seen, what doors had been opened, what noises had been heard. It was an old method in a changing city. Rely on memory, on careful ticking of the clock, and on the testimony of reliable men. The frustration came quite quickly, because memory is a human thing and prone to soft errors. When a town asks for certainty and your instrument is memory and interview, the answers are often qualified and slow. I learned, too, of the other practical difficulties. Dover and the wider police apparatus were jurisdictional puzzles. Part of Whitechapel brushes the City of London's precincts. Mitre Square's site lay within the city boundaries, which meant the city police had jurisdiction there. That difference in authority required the men of different forces to exchange notes and keep their communications clear. Often they did so with a small cordiality. Sometimes there was the friction of two sets of procedures. I, on my small level, saw reports being carried between offices and watched men hand papers over with a cautious efficiency. The public grew anxious as more columns filled with questions. Shopkeepers would ask the constables at the door what they thought could be done. Mothers would tuck their children in later and check that the windows were fastened. I remember that the small domestic acts of caution multiplied. Shutters were latched earlier, lanes were avoided after certain hours, and those who previously took a shortcut now walked the long way around. There is a subtle sorrow in such adjustments. They are sensible, yes, but they are also the city's way of admitting fear into a previous pattern of trust. What I felt personally, then, and in those long dawn hours, was a weariness that was not merely physical. Night seemed longer, smells lingered with more attention, and sleep frayed. I found my pen slowing, seeking the right word for a community's unease. Inspector Reed would sometimes speak softly to me about the difficulties of the work. He would say, almost apologetically, that their methods could be blunt, but that they tried to be careful. "We have no sure course till the facts do align," he told me once, as he folded his hands and looked out at the street. "We must be patient and precise." I carry that phrase still, patient and precise. It was, in those months, an instruction and a comfort. There were days when the city seemed to hold its breath, and there were nights when the patrols multiplied and the watchmen made their rounds with more men than usual. For a while, we used that extra presence as a balm. But presence alone is different from proof, and proof was what the public sought. In the next chapter, I will take you through the sequence of events that made the earlier cases appear connected, and I will tell you of the night of September 30th, when two women, Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, were found within hours of each other. The pattern that would later be recognized began then to take shape, and with it the city's fear widened. But that is a story for the next chapter. Take a deep breath and let the hush in the room settle you. In the previous chapter, I set out how the police organized themselves and how the public's questions grew. Now I will tell you, in the measured way I have promised, how the events of that autumn began to look less isolated and more like pieces of a single, unsettling puzzle. There is no sensationalism in what I say, only the careful recollection of dates, places, and the feelings that accompanied them. After Mary Ann Nichols was found at Bucks Row on August 31st, 1888, the next striking case occurred on September 8th, when Annie Chapman's body was discovered in the yard behind a house in Hanbury Street. The time between those days was only 8 days, and for many of us that short span made an impression. A single tragic death can be folded into ordinary sorrow. Two, close in time, begin to suggest an event repeating itself. Annie Chapman, whom I met in the reports and at the inquest, was about 47 years of age. The constables at the scene in Hanbury Street moved with the same careful procedure I had seen before. They took statements from neighbours and watchmen. They questioned lodging houses nearby. They asked whether anyone had seen or heard an unusual footfall that night. The men of H Division worked with a dedication that wore on their faces. The regular rhythm of their work was interrupted by a new intensity. We watched and we wrote. The ledger's columns began to show more frequent entries about the police rounds, the inquests, and the measures the men were taking to reassure the public. It was in these weeks that many of us began to sense a pattern, not merely of time, but of place. The victims, women who lived and worked at the edges of the market and the lodging houses, were found in quiet yards or courts at hours when the city's noise had already turned inward. People in the neighbourhood began to alter their habits. A woman who had once taken a particular alley now took the main road. Two men I spoke to said they now walked in pairs when their work kept them late, as if a thoughtful company could make the lanes less precarious. Then came the night of September 30th, when two separate discoveries were made within the early hours. Elizabeth Stride was found in Dutfield's yard, Berner Street. Not long after, Catherine Eddowes was found in Mitre Square, inside the city's boundary. To say that these events were close in time is to understate the jolt they gave the city. The two discoveries were within the same early morning hours and in different precincts, which meant both the Metropolitan Police and the City Police had to coordinate. The result was a thorough, though urgent, exchange of reports and statements. When I went about the streets that day, I felt a new kind of hush. People moved with quick purpose. The shops opened with quieter hands. Constables from H Division and officers from the city's forces met to compare notes and to see whether there were footprints, witnesses, or other signs that could link the incidents. The collaboration was earnest and sometimes awkward. Jurisdictional boundaries required attention even as the men tried to do the work of detection. Those weeks I spent many hours at the watch house, with my pen poised. I took down the names of witnesses who thought they had seen someone pass by a yard at the hour in question. I recorded the statements of lodging house keepers who said a certain lodger had left late, or a man had sat on the step longer than usual. The police would mark the times and cross-check them. They used the watchman's clock to determine rounds and asked who had the responsibility for a particular street. It was meticulous, human work. The newspapers, some more sober than others, began to speculate in a way that made some of us uncomfortable. Speculation and fear feed each other. It is a slow and quiet thing to watch a town respond. The mothers who taught their children to avoid a dark corner, the shopkeepers who bolted shutters earlier, the increasing guards at certain markets. All of these were small adjustments, but they added up to a sense that the neighborhood had been turned inward, as if it were keeping vigil. Amid this increased watchfulness, there also came reports of more mundane crimes: pickpocketing, a quarrel in a public house, a scuffle over a debt. The police, while concentrating on the deaths, did not neglect the daily duty of keeping order. They continued to answer for disturbances and to check on the poor and the elderly. I found in their regular diligence something that steadied me: the knowledge that amid small failures and grand uncertainties, men were still doing the work of preserving ordinary safety. It is important to remember, too, that not every claim had weight. Witness memory is fickle. Men and women remember light differently after the news has changed the frame of their day. A man who hours earlier had scarcely noticed a passerby might, after hearing of a death, come forward to say he had seen a suspicious figure. The police were mindful of such effects and tried, as best they could, to separate what was real from what had been coloured by fear. There were nights when I felt watch myself. Perhaps it was the nature of the work, walking lanes where others had suffered, or perhaps it was simply the heightened attention that made me notice the brushes against my sleeve, the soft steps that matched my pace for a moment and then sped away. I would remind myself that the city is full of walkers and that a shadow is often only a man hurrying to his lodgings. I learned to pay careful attention without letting worry swell in my chest. As autumn deepened, the patterns some people now spoke of, sometimes aloud, sometimes in whispers, was of a single hand, a single person moving through the lanes. Others refused the idea entirely, suggesting coincidence or a different explanation. People seek patterns to feel safe. Patterns can bring both danger and a false reassurance. I would speak softly with Inspector Aberline about the hazards of such assumptions. "We must be careful," he said, "not to make the facts tell us what we wish to hear." His restraint helped guide my reporting. Later, much later, in a quiet moment, I would look back and see these days as the stanzas of a slow, troubled poem. Each line was a place, each pause a person watching from a doorway. In the next chapter, I will describe how the letters began to arrive, most famously the one signed Jack the Ripper, and how the city's response shifted from cautious concern to a kind of widespread fixation. But that, as always, is a story for the next chapter. Breathe slowly and let the cadence of my words be a soft companion. In the last chapter, I described how the events of those autumn weeks, Bucks Row, Hanbury Street, the morning of September 30th, began to look less like separate incidents and more like parts of a larger, troubling pattern. In this chapter, I will tell you how unexpected elements entered the story. Letters that arrived and were printed, the coining of a name that would lodge in the public imagination, and the restless press that brought the whole city to a kind of fevered attention. Not long after the double discoveries at Berner Street and Mitre Square, a letter arrived at one of the offices that handled communications for the newspapers. It came addressed, as so many letters did in those days, to the local press. The note began with the salutation, "Dear Boss," and it ended with a signature that would become infamous, "Jack the Ripper." The words were short, disdainful, and styled in a way that suggested either a dark wit or a cruel jest. A copy of this letter was printed in some of the papers, and when the name Jack the Ripper first appeared in print, it captured the public's imagination like an ember blown into a warehouse of straw. The effect was immediate. People who had only glanced at the papers now read every line. The name was a novelty and a provocation. It supplied a sort of villain that newspapers could put before readers' eyes. Some of us in the more sober desks, like Mr. Langley at the Ledger, hung back and gave the letter the careful consideration it deserved. Was the letter genuine? Was it a hoax? Could a person write a sentence and thereby manufacture a public terror? We examined the prose and compared its claims with the facts the police had gathered. The consensus among many professionals was cautious. Some believed it genuine, others pronounced it a fabrication. Skepticism was an important watchword. The police, understandably, did not want to take any single document at face value. Inspector Aberline and Sir Robert Anderson. Anderson viewed the letter with the same measured caution they brought to witness statements. They treated it as potential evidence, but not conclusive. The public, however, is quick to seize upon a name that suits the appetite for explanation. Jack the Ripper had a clarity that facts, with their hesitations and qualifications, often lack. The press's appetite for the story led to daily columns that tried to account for every small rumour. Papers printed descriptions of people seen late at night. They held up pictures of neighbourhood figures who did not, in truth, match the police's concerns, and they published letters from readers proposing theories. There were editorial pleas for calm, alongside sensational headers that increased anxiety. I remember writing a piece for the Ledger that tried to balance the city's need for reassurance with the public's hunger for information. Mr. Langley advised restraint, and I did my best to keep to the measured line. Amid the press's activity came new demands on the police: more patrols, more watchmen, and a visible presence in the lanes that had become places of uneasy reputation. The men in blue did their best with the resources they had. Constables worked in pairs more often, and the watchmen's rounds were sometimes doubled. Yet it is one thing to show a presence and another to find the fact that will answer a question. The police continued methodically to collect witness reports and to keep records of every small possible sighting. The letters did not end with the "Dear Boss" note. Other missives arrived, some apparently from the same hand and others clearly from people seeking attention. Distinguishing between a genuine communication and a hoax became a task unto itself. The city's appetite for certainty made every envelope a possible turning point in the case. Men at the Yard, including Detective Aberline and Sir Robert Anderson. Anderson developed a cautious protocol for handling correspondence. Many letters were disregarded as prankish, others were investigated as if they might contain kernels of truth. The letters also had another effect. They changed the tone of the public conversation. A name, so easy to print and to say, made the matter more immediate and more personal. People began to imagine the unknown figure in more particular terms. They guessed at age and at motive and at manner of dress. This imagining can be understood as a human attempt to make an event less opaque, yet it also risked turning a complex investigation into a theatre of rumour. In the Ledger office, I watched this theatre with a degree of sorrow. There was an unfortunate eagerness in some corners of the press to supply narrative where facts were thin. I did not want to be part of that hunger. I wanted, rather, to give the people of Whitechapel what they deserved: steady reporting, factual accounts, and the kind of caution that does not make spectacle from tragedy. To that end, I spent many nights on the streets, speaking with watchmen and lodging housekeepers, writing down their accounts in the hope that the accumulation of small details might lead to a clearer picture. There is a peculiar loneliness to walking the lanes at night in a city that has begun to turn inward. You notice the shuttered windows, the slower footsteps, the way people avoid loitering. I myself felt watched sometimes, not always because someone looked at me so much as because the city seemed newly self-aware. Everyone was suddenly aware that the night could hold more than before. That feeling shaped my writing and my conversations with the constables. It made me careful with words and careful with the tone of public reports. As autumn went on, some of the letters and their signatories would be dismissed by experts, and the name that had entered the papers would cast a long shadow. The press would not, for a time, let the name fade. Yet a name, even when it is powerful, is no substitute for evidence. In the next chapter, I will speak of the men suggested as suspects over the months and the careful uncertainty that attended every accusation. We will move gently through those possibilities and remember that none of them proved definitive. But that is a story for the next chapter. Breathe slowly and let the room be still around you. In the last chapter, I spoke of letters that arrived and of how the press amplified certain names. In this chapter, I will discuss, with care and restraint, the men whose names were put forward as possible suspects. I will speak of what was known and what remained uncertain, and I will remind you again and again that certainty never came. I was a witness to the conversations. I was not a judge. As the months passed, several names entered the official notes and the private conversations of the police. Montague John Druitt was one of them. He was known to some as a barrister and teacher who, by the end of the year, had died by his own hand in a manner that raised eyebrows and questions. Rumours circulated about his character and his disappearance, and in the press and in private rooms, men asked whether he might have been involved. I remember officers at Scotland Yard making careful notes about him, but there was no conclusive proof to place him at any of the scenes on the nights in question. The fact of his death, coming as it did after the last of the canonical months, gave some a neatness they longed for, but neatness is not evidence. Aaron Kosminski was another name that came into the conversation. He was, as I later learned, a Polish-born man who worked as a hairdresser and lived in and around Whitechapel. His situation and background made him a figure of interest to some investigators, and his name appeared in reports and files. But again, the association never rose to the certainty the public craved. I would speak in the watchhouses with men who said they had seen the name in the margins of a report, and I would watch the constables mark it down with the careful air of professionals doing their duty. George Chapman, whose birth name was Surin Kwasowski, was later convicted of poisoning and executed for those crimes. His later conviction made some in the newspapers and among the public inclined to attach to him further culpability. It is human to want a single answer to a series of questions. It is human, too, to see connections where the law requires proof. Chapman's subsequent conviction for other offences coloured the way some people read the earlier cases, but, as the police repeatedly noted, the case connected to the Whitechapel events remained unresolved. These are not the only names that were mentioned. There were, as there always are, people who offered theories and who saw in a neighbour's odd habit a motive for terrible acts. The police had to listen and, where warranted, to investigate. That work was slow and often frustrating. Officers would interview a person who had offered an allegation and then have to find corroboration through witness statements or an account that fit the facts of time and place. Too often, research led to more questions than answers. The limits of the period's investigative tools made the search more difficult. The methods available to the police were based chiefly on witness testimony, local knowledge, and the surgeon's analysis. There were beginnings of certain scientific techniques. Photography, for instance, had become a tool in investigations, but the systematic use of fingerprints and other methods we associate with modern policing were not yet standard practice in a way that could be turned to account quickly. When I spoke with Inspector Aberline, he would often note the need for patience and for careful, ordinary policing. More watchers on the street, better recording of where people slept, and careful attention to those who had few ties to the community. Public pressure, as you have heard, was constant. I remember a particular evening when a clerk at the yard came into the ledger's office with a tired face and said quietly, "They ask for someone to blame. They ask for the man who will make them sleep again." That was one of the cruel pressures of the moment. Numbers of citizens and of officials who wanted an answer that would restore a sense of safety. The police were criticised for not acting quickly enough, and yet every rushed step risks error. Men like Sir Robert Anderson attempted to balance the need for public reassurance with the careful work of a methodical investigation. There were rumours, too, of doctors and of men who had been seen near lodging houses, of stories told in pubs that spread to the papers. It is the nature of rumour to provide a sense of narrative where facts are incomplete. I wrote against rumour where I could, insisting on corroborated statements and careful language. Yet even my restraint was sometimes dimmed by the heat of a crowd outside the ledger's office, demanding the latest list of suspects. What we have learned since is this: none of the men whose names I have mentioned was definitively proven to be the person responsible for the Whitechapel killings, as history recorded them. The files at the yard hold their notes, and later historians have sifted those entries for meaning. In my own memory, the names remain as signposts of uncertainty, markers of a time when many men and women tried to answer a terrible question and found over and over again only more questions. It is a simple mercy, perhaps, that certainty eluded us. Certainty would have required proof strong enough to satisfy both law and conscience. Instead, we had suspicion and conjecture, and that particular unnerving fog of not knowing. I will say something more about the ways historians and modern researchers have returned to these files in later years in the chapter after next. For now, I want you to hold this quiet fact. In the autumn and early winter of 1888, a number of names were presented, discussed, and investigated, but none yielded the final answer. When I think back to those days, I remember the men at the station with their hats in their hands, and the handwritten notes they passed over in a careful exchange, like people handling fragile objects. I remember the patient repetition of the same questions and the slow accumulation of small facts. Our tools were human memory, watchman's rounds, witness recollection, and the surgeon's judgment. These instruments did good work, but they were not, in the end, decisive. In the next chapter, I will describe how the inquiries wound down, how the city adjusted, and how the murders, so far as we could tell, ceased as abruptly as they had begun. But that is a story for the next chapter. Breathe slowly and let the space around you be gentle. In the last chapter, I spoke of the names that were raised, the limits of our tools, and the patient work of men at the Yard and at H Division. Now, I will speak about how the months that followed gradually wound down into a quieter strain of life, and about how the cases that had seized the city's attention came to an uneasy, unresolved pause. After the autumn and its tight sequence of discoveries, there was a marked change in the city's rhythm. The murders that had so disturbed us seemed to stop, with the discovery of Mary Jane Kelly in early November. On or around November 9th, 1888, at her lodging in Miller's Court. I walked the lane to her case like I had walked to the others, and I took my notes as I had before. The difference was not in the method, police procedure remained careful, but in the sense that the series of events had reached a finality they themselves did not make clear. The span from August 31st to November 9th was only a matter of weeks, 70 days in which the city's nights had altered their manner. For many of us, the cessation of the attacks produced a complicated feeling. Relief, certainly, in the sense that fewer nights felt potential traps. Yet the relief was threaded with questions. Had the person responsible moved on, been jailed for something else, or died? Had the small pattern we thought we had discerned been an illusion, a series of unfortunate coincidences? Those questions lingered like winter fog, slow to lift. The police continued their inquiries and kept the files open, but the public attention moved in fits and starts. Newspapers printed retrospectives and letters speculating on motives and on missing evidence. The public, often eager for closure, sometimes mistook the absence of an answer for a solved riddle, and sometimes mistook continued silence for confession. The Metropolitan Police and the men of Scotland Yard kept their records. Files were created, statements were appended, and bits of evidence were stored. Men like Inspector Aberline and Sir Robert Anderson did what their training and conscience required. They kept notes and pursued leads that could be substantiated. There were reviews within the police force about how resources were allocated. The case pressed upon men the need for more systematic methods of record keeping and for better coordination between departments. A slow evolution of practice began in those days and afterward. Less a revolution than a series of small, sensible reforms. One of the practical legacies was an increased attention to night patrols and to the training of local constables in taking careful witness statements. Officers began to emphasize the practice of recording times precisely and mapped more carefully the movements of patrols. The police also took note of the public's need for timely, calm updates and sometimes coordinated with the press to provide accurate statements. My own newspaper made an effort to report crimes with more guarded language, to avoid hasty inferences, and to give the police latitude to complete their work. In the neighborhoods like Whitechapel, the return to ordinary life took its own time. Shopkeepers reopened their shutters, though some left a corner shutter closed for a while longer than usual. Mothers resumed old habits, but with a new caution. Nightly habits changed subtly. Women took slightly different routes home. Groups increased in number when people walked late. The city's social charities and friendly societies redoubled their efforts to care for the poor and the vulnerable, who had often been the most affected by the month's events. I remember meetings in parish rooms, careful planning, and the steady work of those who wished to prevent loneliness and to improve the conditions that left people exposed. As years moved on, the memory of those weeks kept its own gentle power. Conversations at the ledger sometimes returned to the case, not with heat, but with the soft gravity of people who had lived through a time when their neighborhood had shivered. I continued to visit H Division's offices and to speak with the men whose names I had grown to know. They had grown older, perhaps a little harder, but their commitment remained. We would talk quietly about methods that might have helped had they been available then, new techniques in record keeping and in identification that time would bring. There were also broader reflections. The events of 1888 prompted some in public office to argue for improvements in social conditions, less overcrowding, better lighting in yards and courts, and the provision of safer shelter for those without homes. Not all remedies came quickly, and the structural difficulties of poverty persisted, but the attention the case brought to certain neighborhoods did spur discussions about municipal responsibility. These conversations were slow and practical and, I believe, important. The cultural legacy, too, began to take shape. Plays, pamphlets, and columns discussed the events with a variety of tones, some somber, some exploitative. The name that had been coined in a letter continued to circulate in the public imagination. I wish to be clear, a name is only a sign. It does not carry evidence. Yet the image a city forms of itself is powerful. Whitechapel remained a place of resilience, of small mercies and stubborn everyday life, even as it carried the memory of the months when nights had felt less safe. We must keep in mind the most important thing. The investigations, though diligent, yielded no definitive answer that satisfied the standards of the law or of conscience. The case stayed open in the records and in the minds of men like Aberline, but certainty was not achieved. That lack of a conclusive solution has itself become part of the story's legacy, an enduring reminder of the limits of knowledge and the importance of careful, humane policing. In the next chapter, I will reflect on the aftermath and on how the case continued to shape the city and our understanding of policing and society. I will look back at how Whitechapel gradually returned to its own rhythms, although always with an echo of those nights in which we held our breath. But that is a story for the next chapter. Take a slow, steady breath, and let my words be a gentle companion. In the last chapter, I spoke of how the months wound down, and of how the city adjusted to a quieter, though not unmarked existence. Now I will reflect, gently and with charity, on the aftermath of those weeks in the autumn of 1888, the way policing evolved, the cultural imprint left upon the city, and the long, patient work of remembering. When the immediate crisis of the months receded, the Metropolitan Police and the City Police both took stock. Men like Inspector Aberline and Sir Robert Anderson continued in their duties, carrying the case files as part of their broader obligations. The practical lessons that arose included a greater emphasis on coordinated policing across jurisdictions and the importance of systematic record keeping. These were slow improvements, small changes in the methods of a large institution, but they mattered. The men who had been ground down by long nights and by the public's clamour sought reforms that would reduce the likelihood that future victors would find the same difficulties. Over time, the tools of detection improved. Photographic techniques became more reliable, and fingerprinting, which had been in early development, would later be used in ways not possible in 1888. Forensic science as a practice moved forward in stages, not leaps. It would be decades before some of the methods that modern readers imagine were part of everyday policing. Even so, the memory of the difficulties led to the steady reform that helps investigators today. Whitechapel itself settled back into its own daily patterns, though the echo of those months never entirely left it. Lodging houses maintained their routines, shopkeepers returned to the cadence of supply and sale, and neighbours resumed their quiet acts of kindness. Yet people, who had been there then, carried a subtle new caution in their steps. They watched more often. They did not assume the night safe, and they placed small prudences into their days. One more candle left burning, one more friend called on a late night. As for the cultural legacy, the events entered public discourse in many forms. Plays and pamphlets tried to grapple with what had happened, and writers turned to the subject with different aims. Some sought to understand, others to profit from the public's appetite for drama. The name that had been printed in a letter persisted in popular imagination. It made its way into conversation and into the ways people told one another stories in parlours and pubs. I watched the name pass from paper to conversation with a mix of unease and curiosity. A moniker can shape a public sense of an event as powerfully as any single fact. Scholars and later investigators would return to the files, examining witness statements and the notes kept at the yard. In the years that followed, the case would inspire theories and conjectures, many of them sincere, some speculative. I read some of these later accounts with interest and with caution. It is tempting to lay together modern methods and old evidence and think that a missing puzzle can be pieced together anew. Sometimes new techniques produce promising lines of inquiry. Other times, the gaps remain. The truth of those months resists easy closure. I am often asked, years later, whether there was a moment when the truth felt near. My memory answers with a quiet refusal. There were moments when a new witness claimed knowledge, when a letter arrived that seemed to corroborate, when a man's strange behaviour invited suspicion. Each of those moments carried a surge of expectation, and so often that expectation dissolved under scrutiny. We were forced to live with the discomfort of uncertainty. There is another after effect that I must mention. The ways in which the case changed the public's relationship to the police and to the press. The police were urged to be more transparent, to communicate more calmly and consistently. The press, for its part, had to contend with the consequences of sensational reporting and to consider how the pursuit of readers might be balanced with service to the public good. These lessons were learned imperfectly and at different paces, but they were, I believe, important steps toward a more thoughtful public life. When I stroll, in my later years, past the lanes I once walked nightly, I feel a tenderness that is not merely nostalgia. It is a tenderness for a city that has borne much, poverty, industry, sorrow, and small mercies, and that continues to hold people in ways both visible and hidden. I think often of the women I have named in these pages, of their simple humanity and of the ways in which their lives were threaded into the fabric of the neighborhood. Memory is, in a way, a form of care. Speaking their names with reverence is an act I carry with me. You might ask what we, as a society, learned most of all. I will say this gently. We learned that vigilance and compassion must go together. It is not enough to increase patrols or to sharpen investigative tools. We must also care for the vulnerable, improve living conditions that make people exposed, and build community ties that are strong enough that neighbors are not isolated. The practical reforms of policing are vital, but so are the small human remedies of charity, shelter, and steady support. As this chapter winds down, take another deep breath and let the warmth of a lamplit room settle around you. In the next and final chapter, I will bring you with me to the dawn that follows those long nights, and to my own later years, where memory rests and the fog lifts just a little. But that is a story for the final chapter. Take a deep breath, and let your eyes grow heavy if they wish. We have walked the lanes together, and you have been a patient companion. In the previous chapters, I told you of the streets before the fear, the discovery at Bucks Row, the careful work of the police, the days when patterns began to be suspected, the letters that named a figure the papers would call Jack the Ripper, the men whose names were discussed as suspects, and the long aftermath in which certainty never came. Now, gently, I will close this chapter of my telling with the soft image of a dawn when the fog lifts and the city breathes again. Years later, when I walk the same routes, the gas lamps are changed by brighter light, and the faces in the windows are different. But there is a steady, comforting continuity. Children playing on the steps, market stalls making their slow preparations for the day, an old man who still knows the companionable creak of a cart. The lanes have changed in small ways. They have kept their character in others. The seasons pass, and the fog rolls in sometimes as a reminder of the city's moods. But the mornings arrive consistently, with braiding light and the gentle bells of parish churches calling to the day. The mornings after those long months always seem to have a peculiar clarity, as if having held its breath, the city allowed itself a slow, exhaled calm. The streets were empty in that early hour, and the lamps burned low. I would walk with my coat turned up against the dew and think of how many nights had passed since the autumn of 1888, when the streets were more watchful and the people more careful. There was, in the quiet, the memory of the women whose names I have spoken aloud in these chapters. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. I say them again now with a quiet reverence, for speaking a name keeps it from being forgotten. One of the gentlest truths I discovered was that time does not erase memory, but transforms how we carry it. Men who had been constables then grew into older men who told their stories without the sharpness of fear, often with a softer, reflective tone. I myself grew into a man who often tells these events at a low volume, in a voice meant not to alarm, but to remember. The ledger kept its records, and I kept my notebooks, pages upon pages of the sober, measured notes we took in those days. In later years, historians would consult those very pages and ask questions I could not answer. My modest contribution to history was always the same, to write plainly what I saw and to leave speculation to those more suited to its work. If you have listened this far, perhaps you feel the city with me. Perhaps you have a lane of your own, a street you walk at dusk, a window you look out of, a neighbor whose light you watch return each night. There is a lesson in the small domestic acts of life, They are anchors in the storms of history. A kettle boiled on a stove, a door closed with a soft click, a lamp left burning by a bedside. These are measures that keep everyday life from drift. We must also hold gently the people who sought answers, the men and women at the yard, the constables on the night patrols, the doctors, the lodging house keepers, the clerks who kept the files. Their work was often patient and mostly ordinary, and their dedication deserves soft acknowledgement. They sought the truth as best they could with the instruments of their time, and with a persistence that is worth remembering. As for the questions left unanswered, there are many. We do not have the final truth that some hearts longed for in those months. There are theories and debates that would continue long after the dust settled. And yet, it is possible, I think, to sit with the discomfort of not knowing and still find peace. The world is made of mysteries as well as answers. Some we resolve and some we carry as parts of our shared history. Now, as you prepare to close your eyes, let the fog of the streets be a soft curtain falling. Imagine the lamps dimming and the bells that mark the hour. Think of a city that breathes and goes on, with its mistakes and its wonders, its small mercies and its ordinary kindnesses. You may wonder, as I do, how memory shapes us and how we learn to live under a sky that sometimes brings storms. My answer is this: with patience, with care for one another, and with the steady work of keeping one another safe, I will end as I began, with a gentle invitation. If you like this telling, please subscribe and like so that more quiet stories may find their way to you. Tell me where you are listening from and what hour it is where you are. If there is another case you wish to hear in this voice, one that asks not to wake you but to soothe your mind, tell me and I will listen. For now, good night. Let the city breathe beneath the dawn and let the streets rest. Carry the names of those we have remembered with soft hands. If thoughts arise in the night, let them come and go as clouds. Sleep, for the morning will come and the lamps will be lit anew. I will remember the lanes, and I will, at times, walk them again in my mind. But tonight, rest. Sweet dreams.